Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, the Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 175, which is the beginning of the Mike Carey run of Hellblazer. But just a little catch-up before we get into that. In issue 174, we finished the Brian Azzarello run of Hellblazer, and at the end of that, everybody that knew John was alive still from being dead in prison was dead. Agent Frank Turro was dead. Richie Furman was dead. I believe he was actually the corpse that got burned in the club. Even though that's never said, but since John is still alive in issue 175, we can assume that. And of course, S.W. Manor is dead as well. So everybody that knew John was alive still doesn't. So as far as American authorities are concerned, John Constantine's dead and he died in a prison riot. And that's where we're starting this one off. So first things first with issue 175, we got the cover. We see John sitting down in a chair looking up at us. And he's got a glass of something alcoholic and also a cigarette, of course. And there's a stamp over top of him, which looks like some sort of postage stamp, like as if he was mailing himself from America to Britain, and he's like sitting in some sort of box. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Mike Carey, with art by Steve Dillon. So yes, we got Steve Dillon back to do the art for this first arc of Mike Carey's run. It's kind of nice because he's back in England, and it all just looks correct. And on the first page, we see a shaggy-looking John as he's arriving to England on a boat. He's got long hair and a beard, and he's not wearing his usual trench coat. He just has on jeans and some sort of black jacket. And as the boat is coming towards land, we get some narration that says, he came in on a garbage boat. A shite boat, he called it. Down from Ellesmere Port, where he probably sneaked onto a container ship, cash down. He said he wanted to avoid all the palaver, the marching bands, the speeches, the key to the city. Then we see John getting off the boat and onto a dock, and the captain of the boat is counting some money John must have given him because he's saying, 450, 5, cheers. Yeah, our kid's got a lorry if you need a lift. And John kind of smiles and takes out a cigarette and lights it, and as he does, he says, no thanks, mate. I like the fresh air. And then he begins to walk down the streets of London, and over these panels we get some narration that says, he walked on down the dock road. He says every time he comes back, they've pulled something else down, and he's got a few less memories. He tries not to look now. It ruins his mood. Caught a 30A at the pierhead, and he was off to Everton Valley. And just so you know, the 30A is a bus, and the narration continues. The liverbirds are meant to fly away if a virgin or an honest bloke goes past. They stayed put. Then we turn the page, and we cut to an apartment high-rise building called Elster Tower. And when we cut to the inside, we see there's a man tying a rope to a banister, and it looks like he's trying to kill himself because he puts the rope over his neck and prepares to jump. And as he ties the rope to the banister, he says, over under, there you go, you bastards. I worked at Harland and Wolves. I can tie a bloody knot. Well, you should have called, shouldn't you? Where is everyone, eh? After 50 friggin' years. When I was a kid, there was none of these drugs and sex going on. I worked at Harland and Wolves when it meant something. And with that last line, he jumps off the banister with the rope tied around his neck. And we couldn't really see how high he was jumping from, but it turns out he was only on the second floor, so he jumps down and he breaks his neck and hangs himself right in the middle of the lobby. And as we turn the page, we cut to a little bit in the future where cops are now on the scene and other residents are coming in and looking at this dead body. And the cop on the first floor is talking to the residents that are kind of gawking at the situation, saying, all right, come on out of it. We're not selling tickets. And then the cop on the second floor who's struggling with the knots that this guy tied says, sod it, a bloody reef knot, because he's struggling so hard to untie it. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is High on Life Part 1. And on the next page, we see the cops talking to all the other people that were gawking and saying, any more witnesses? I need names and I need addresses. And as he's saying that, we see a shaggy John Constantine walk through the front door. And one of the cops looks at him like they're expecting him to give his name and address. And he looks at the cop and says, don't look at me, mate. I'm just visiting. And then he looks over at the commotion and says, topped himself, did he? And the cop says, no, he was working for a bloody scout badge. What's it look like? And John kind of smiles and says, "You the scoutmaster then? I still need train spotting and wilderness survival." And then he walks past the officer, and then we cut to John ringing the doorbell on an apartment that says number 5. And over that panel, we get some narration that says, "He said the best way to avoid being noticed is to be loud and obvious, but he felt the copper's eyes on him all the way up the stairs. He leaned hard on the bell. He had reasons of his own to stay on silent running." Then we see a woman approaching the door as the bell rings, and she's saying, "Oh, bloody hell, we've already got the bloody watchtower." And then as she opens the door, John just walks inside and says, "Morning, sis. Long time no see, eh?" And Cheryl looks surprised as she says, "Christ, John!" But John just turns to her and says, "Close the door." But she still holds it open and says, "Jesus bloody Christ, John!" And John repeats again, "Yeah, get the door closed." But it looks like she doesn't, because John has to close it himself, and then he says, "There, much more cozy. So anyway, how have things been?" And he's just acting super casual, but Cheryl is looking like she's seeing a ghost. And then out of nowhere, she slaps him across the face and gets very angry and says, 18 bloody months! They said you were dead! And John tries to calm her down, saying, "All right, Cheryl, bloody hell." But she fires back, "They told us you were fucking dead!" And then she looks disgusted and hurt and says, "Just another one of your rotten scams." And John looks very remorseful and he says, "Cheryl, honest, if I had any choice." But she cuts him off saying, "Oh, you selfish bastard. Gemma was bloody devastated. She stayed up in that room for weeks." And then she starts to cry and says, "I reckon it was your fault she left." And this is new information to John, and he asks, "Hey?" But she just walks away from him and says, "Oh, make us a cup of tea." And then she thinks again and says, "No, don't bother. Get us a wine out of the fridge. And keep it quiet. His nibs is on nights." And I had to look that up because I wasn't sure what nibs was, but apparently it's a mocking way to say someone's in authority. So we can assume that she's talking about her husband, and he's sleeping because he's tired from just after his shift of working nights. So we turn the page and we cut to some time ahead where they're both sitting in the living room. Cheryl's sitting on a couch with her glass of wine, and John's across from her sitting in a chair, and he's asking, "So you saw the bloke on the stairwell?" And Cheryl answers, "It was me called the police. Peter was his name. Lived upstairs. I'm glad our Gemma wasn't here to see that." And then John asks, "Well, where is she then? And why'd you move out of Nimrod Street into a shithole like this?" And Cheryl answers, "She's in France, John. Teaching assistant down in Lyons. That's why we're here. The council said we had to trade down a flat on account of it just being the two of us. And she's useless at letters. All we get are these bloody postcards. Having a lovely time. Where the fuck am I?" And as Cheryl says that, we see John reach down and look at one of these postcards, and it says, "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. The weather's great, but the students are crap. The only nightclub in town plays 70s retro. I'd sooner knit. Love, Jem." And then he looks back up at her, and she's staring at her wine glass, and she says, "Shit, I shouldn't drink this on an empty stomach. It's like bloody battery acid." Then we turn the page and we cut to some time later, because there's a bunch more drinks on the table, and we see a bunch of old cigarettes in the ashtray. And in their time, John basically caught her up on everything that happened in the last 18 months, and he's finishing his story saying, "So then it seemed like a good idea to drop out of the picture for a while." And Cheryl asks, "What about your passport?" And John answers, "Come in under the water, Cheryl. Gotta keep a low profile. Stay under the radar like." And then he puts out his cigarettes and he begins to stand up and says, "Look, I've gotta go. I've got some stuff to sort out. Where are you gonna be tonight?" And then she stands and grabs his arms and she answers, "The Glebe, on County Road. But you only just got here." And John looks down at her sad as he says, "I know. I'll stop by before the tower goes up. Don't worry. Take care, Cheryl." Then we see him exit the apartment, and he walks for a bit until he comes across a diner called Uncle Joe's. Then we cut to the inside of the diner where we see John is reading the Post newspaper, and on it the headline says, "Kirby woman was striptease victim." Then we see a tall, bald man who's got a white mustache walk up to John, and he's got a very dirty apron that says Uncle Joe's, and he gives John what looks like a piece of toast and a cup of coffee or tea, and he says, "Fried slice, cup of tea." And then John looks up and says, "Thanks, mate. You hear about that nasty business over the road this morning?" And the server answers, "It's always bloody the same at Elster, ain't it? That bloke put his wife's eyes out lived over there. And them kids that skinned that dog. And then the server puts John's food down, and as he walks away, John says, "Sick building syndrome, you reckon?" And as the man walks away, he turns his head and says, "Sick something. It's never any different round here. Hang the sodding lot of 'em, I say." And then as he walks away, we see a young woman who also has an Uncle Joe's apron on walk up to John, and she's got a bottle of some kind of sauce, and she says, "You want some brown sauce on that?" And John doesn't look at her, but he answers, "Yeah, drown it, love. I reckon it'd be a mercy killing." And then he holds up his plate of whatever he was brought to her. And when she's done pouring the sauce on, she's still there, and she asks, "So what's your name then?" And John looks up at her this time, and he mockingly says, "Food Standards Inspector. What's yours?" And then she gets a coy look on her face like she knows something John doesn't, and she says, "Magic." And then she just sits down at his table, and John points at her and says, "Of course. Paul Daniels. I didn't recognize you without the wig." And he's joking, of course, because Paul Daniels is an old magician. So to John's witty remark, she gets kind of mad and says, "Bollocks. Don't try to laugh it off. I'm into it myself. I can probably help you." And John just kind of stares at her as he takes a sip of his coffee, not saying anything. And then John pulls out a pack of cigarettes, and he pulls one out, and he says, "Okay, so who are the big players locally? If I want my wife's toy boy to start shitting razor blades, who do I go to?" And the woman says, "Oh, for fuck's sake." But John continues to stare at her very seriously as he lights his cigarette, and he asks, "What about zombies? Say I want to shag one, or rent a few to work someone over, or I'm desperate to score a pint or so of baby blood. Where's the best place to buy?" And then the woman just kind of looks at John and smiles a second and says, "Is that the lot, or is there more after the adverts?" And John says, "I'm just making a point, love. Magic's a nasty game. Go play with your dad's chainsaw instead." And then she teasingly says, "I reckon you get on with my dad. He's a macho twat as well. All right, Lone Ranger, piss off into the sunset then." And John actually smiles at that one and he says, "Lone Ranger? Like it." Then he changes the subject and asks, "Do you know anything about Elster Tower?" And she asks, "Why? What's special about Elster?" And John answers, "It stinks of fear and despair is what. It's a great big spike of evil sticking out of a field of grass, and my sister's living there." And then the woman stands up and writes something on a notepad, and she says, "Well, it's a council block, isn't it?" And John sarcastically answers, "Oh, silly me. That explains everything." But she continues, "And all them nasty incidents, they're all this year." And as she hands him the piece of paper off her notebook, she says, "Council do a tenants register down Castle Street. Here, keep the receipt." And John asks, "What for? The tax man?" And as she turns and walks away, she says, "No, it's got my phone number on it. Angie Spatchcock. I'm a real piece of work. Ask anyone." And as she walks away, John kind of looks at her like he's intrigued maybe. And since it seems like Angie might be a main character going forward, I'll describe her right now. Like I said, she's a young woman, and she is wearing an apron because she works at Uncle Joe's, but she's white with short brown hair and striking blue eyes, and something kind of unique about her from other Steve Dillon characters that he draws, she has really full lips. She's kind of got like an Angelina Jolie vibe. Then we turn the page, and we cut to what looks like an office where there's a security guard, and this must be the council that she was talking about. And John is just rummaging through the file cabinets of this place as a security guard reads a newspaper and doesn't even seem to notice him. So I'm assuming John did some kind of magic. And over this panel, the narration says, "Score one for Angie. He knew it was a good idea. He was only annoyed that he hadn't thought of it first." Then in the next panel, we see him pull out some registration cards for the tenants of this Elster Towers place. And we can see some names on them. They say Masters, Dunbar, Tressel, and Wren. And of course, Masters is Cheryl, John's sister's last name. And as John looks at the information cards, the narration says, "Bingo. There were only 4 new tenants at Elster. 3 if you didn't count his own lot. Didn't have to be an inside job, of course, but it was somewhere to start." Then we see John walking into the front doors of Elster Towers, and the narration says, "No coppers or gawkers this time, but he felt it again as he walked through the door. Or tasted it, maybe. The sickness in the air. The pain." Then we see John ringing a doorbell of a flat that says number 12, and the narration says, "Dunbar, Tressel, and Wren." Might as well do them in alphabetical order. Then we see a middle-aged bald man answer the door and say, "Yeah?" And John looks at him and says, "Hello, Mr. Dunbar. I'm from the works department. I gotta check your window seals." And as John walks in, we see the whole place is actually painted pink. And John is, I guess, confused by this. And as he walks into one of the rooms that is also pink, he looks at the window because he's supposed to be inspecting window seals. And he asks, "You got kids then?" And Mr. Dunbar answers, "Nah, the wife collects teddies," meaning teddy bears, because there's a bunch of teddy bears around as well. And Mr. Dunbar continues, "I pick them up for rummage sales and that. I got a stiffy at St. Nathaniel's." And John smiles because that's like a double entendre, and he asks Mr. Dunbar, "You mean a stief? Or at least I hope you do." And I had to look this up, but a stief is a type of fancy teddy bear. And then John begins to walk out of the room and he says, "Your window seals are immaculate, Squire. Could eat me dinner off them. Cheers." Then we cut to John at another flat ringing the doorbell, and this flat says 15 on it. And as John rings the doorbell, he says, "We're on the road to nowhere. Come inside." And then a man answers the door who's looking kind of squirrely. He's got a thin pencil mustache and round glasses, and he looks kind of nervous as he opens the door to John, and John asks, "Mr. Tressel, is it?" And Tressel answers, "The Reverend Tressel, in actual fact. Can I help you?" And John says, "Just a random call from social services to see if you're cohabitating. Shall I put down no?" And since John didn't even go into that flat, we can assume he didn't get any weird vibes from Tressel. Then we see John walking up the stairs, and as he looks at the last card, the narration says, "That left Wren. Gladys, Mrs. Top floor of the effing building. Had to be, didn't it?" And just as John gets to the top of the stairs, he looks up at the door he's supposed to be going to, and we don't see what it looks like, but he just says, "Fuck." And then we turn the page and we see what it looks like, and it's a door that has a 20 on it, but on either side of the door jamb is magical symbols written on the walls. Then someone from behind John asks, "Anything I can do for you, pal?" And John turns and says, "Depends. I'm from the council. I'm meant to be checking up on," but the man cuts him off saying, "Piss off." And then he grabs John by the jacket and he pulls him close and says, "Or you'll be going down the stairs on your fucking head. Bumpity bumpity bump." And John calmly says, "Now that seems unnecessarily harsh." Then just as it looks like something might happen between them, an old lady opens the door and says, "Nigel, don't you dare." And Nigel, the guy that was attacking John, turns to her and says, "Mom, I was just..." But his mom says, "No, I won't tell you again." And as Nigel goes in the house very reluctantly, he kind of shoots an evil glance at John, and then Gladys looks at John and says, "I'm so sorry, mister." And without skipping a beat, John says, "Collier. John Collier. It's okay. I think I got the wrong address anyway." And then John walks down the stairs, but as he does, we see the old woman come out of her doorway and watch him walk down the stairs. Then we turn the page and we see Angie, the girl from the diner, talking on a phone, and she's saying, "Sorry, John, I don't get it. You had a feeling? What kind of feeling?" Then we see John in a pub and he's calling from a payphone and he says, "Peace. Contentment. It's hard to describe. Dunbar and Tressel were dead ends. Harmless old codgers. This was different." And it seems like Angie is in her room because we see her packing a bunch of equipment into a duffel bag, and she's asking John, "What about the skinhead then?" And by skinhead, she means Nigel, the son of Gladys, who was giving John a hard time. I didn't describe him, but he had a shaved head, so he's a skinhead who's taller than John, and he had a leather jacket and jeans on. And then Angie asks a good question, saying, "If Gladys is the Dalai Lama, then why does she need a bouncer?" And John kind of smiles at that and says, "I don't know, but the whole of that top floor just had this incredibly good vibe. And so did she. No fear, no madness. Listen, my sister just walked in. Are you coming over or what?" And Angie kind of smiles at that as she continues packing her bag, and she says, "Nah, I'm washing my hair tonight. Come in tomorrow. I might have some news for you." And then she hangs up and walks out the door with her duffel bag. Then we turn the page and we cut to John at the pub, just having got off the phone with Angie, and he's walking up to his sister Cheryl and her husband Tony, and he says, "Cheryl, Tony, what can I get you?" And Cheryl answers, "Mine's a milk stout, John. I'm just off to the ladies." So as she walks away to the restroom, we see John and Tony standing there, and we know from past experiences that they do not like each other. And Tony says to John, "So you're not dead then, John?" And John, who's got his back to Tony because he's buying beer, says, "No, Tone, I am dead. I'm just doomed to walk the earth a bit, that's all." And Tony says, "You've gotten into some trouble, I take it." And John answers, "Past tense. I sorted it out." And then Tony kind of angrily asks, "Do you think Cheryl needs this kind of stress?" And then John turns to him with a pint and he smiles and says, "The stress of seeing me raised from the grave, you mean? Well, she's a big girl. Why don't you ask her?" And then Tony fires back, "Because she's in the ladies, copping a couple tazepam, so she can be half chemicked before she starts. Makes it hard-like." And then John takes a second to think about that, because I guess he just thought, Cheryl was taking it in stride, but now he's realizing it might have affected her more. Then we turn the page and we cut to Angie, and it's nighttime if you didn't guess that already, and she is arriving at the courtyard of Elster Tower. Now, when I say courtyard, it's just a field of grass around Elster Tower flats. And she stops in the middle of the field, and she sets down her duffel bag and begins to remove a bunch of equipment. And as she sets it up, we see it's some sort of telescope. And over these panels of her doing that, we get some narration that says, "Little Angie had an idea, didn't she? A cunning plan. A spike of evil," he said, "sticking out of a field of dead grass. And so it was, more or less. Science is the new magic. You've got to take a bite out of the zeitgeist, right?" So as she starts looking around with, it's not a telescope, it's some sort of looking glass, like the kind that surveyors use when they're about to do construction on a plot of land. So she starts writing down some notes in her notebook as she's looking at specific points with her scope. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the bar, where we see John, Cheryl, and Tony are sitting at a table. And of course, Tony looks like he doesn't want to be there, but John and Cheryl are talking, and John is saying, "Look, you want to get out of that place. Go to Tony's mom's or somewhere, just for a few days." And Cheryl asks, "Why? What's the matter?" And John looks at her seriously and says, "What's the matter is, you're having white wine for breakfast, and now Tony says you've got a bit of a trank habit. It's bad friggin' medicine." And then Cheryl looks into her purse, and she pulls out another postcard, and she says, "It's got nothing to do with the flat. It's Gemma. I know she's better off out of here, with all these murders and everything. But still, I just wish she would call us or something. I want to hear her voice." And she starts to cry, and she puts her head in her hands. And as John takes the postcard, he says to her, "I mean it, Cheryl. Your best bet is to have a break." And then Tony chimes in very angrily, and he says, "It's a break from you she needs. Every time you come back, it's worse. If you had any decency, you'd stay away." And John turns to him and he says, "All right, Tony, save it up till peacetime, mate. There's stuff going on that..." But he's cut off by Tony, who yells back, "No, that's bloody well enough. You turn everything into a big mystery that only you know the answer to. Well, I can look after my own family. I don't need you, and I never did." And then John stands up from the table very angry, and he says, "You god-bothering moron. I wouldn't trust you to look after a whippet." And in case you didn't know, a whippet is a little kind of greyhound type of dog. And at that, Tony gets very angry, and he begins to stand up, and he starts pointing to the door, and he says, "You are not going to mock my faith. Outside! Outside now!" And that's it. Cheryl has had enough, and she stands up and screams, "Oh, for Christ's sake, shut up!" And both men do shut up, and then she begins to walk out, and she says back to Tony, "Give me some carry out. You know what I like. John, you come and get your stuff, and then piss off out of it. I've had enough of the pair of you." And then she walks out of the pub, and then John looks at Tony and kind of smiles and jokingly says, "Well, that was close. I thought she was really going to lose her rag or something." Then we turn the page, and we cut back to Angie, who's still in the middle of the field looking through her scope, and it seems like she's found something because she's smiling, and she says, "Oh yeah, got an angle on you now, all right." Then we can see what she's looking at, and it's the window of the old woman Gladys, and we see Gladys pull the curtains open and look down at her, and then all of a sudden, Angie's vision goes blurred, and she gets dizzy, and she starts to fall over like she's getting vertigo or something, and she knocks the scope over as well. But before she hits the ground, we see Nigel, the son of Gladys, catch her, and he's with another guy who says, "Whoops, mind how you go. You okay, love?" And Angie doesn't realize who's talking to her, and she says, "Shit, no, I think I'm having some kind of attack." And then that same man opens up a straight razor blade and says, "You know what? I think you could be right." And then he takes her hand and he slices down her palm, and she cries out, Jesus, get your... But before she can finish her sentence, he slashes out with the razor blade towards her face, and he cuts her cheek, and then she falls to the ground, and then both men, Nigel and this guy wielding the knife, are on top of her. Then we turn the page, and we cut to John, Tony, and Cheryl walking down an alley on their way back to Elster Towers. And Cheryl is walking ahead of both men, and John is pleading with her, saying, "Look, Cheryl, I'm only thinking of you." And Cheryl says, "Well, there's a bloody change." But before she has anything else to say, they come out of the alley and they come upon this attack happening to Angie. So they see Angie on the ground and two men kind of kneeling over her, and it looks like they're doing something more with the knife. And Angie says, "Oh my God, look, John, stop them." So John and Tony run over, and Tony yells, "Oi, you bloody hooligans, sod off." And so Tony chases them off, and John runs over to Angie on the ground, but he doesn't know it's her yet, because her back is to him, and he says, "You're all right, love. They didn't get your bag. Everything's still." But then she turns over, and we see her hand is covered with blood, and she says very weakly, "John, is that you?" And John looks horrified when he sees her, and then we see her face in silhouette as she tries to turn over again, and we see blood dripping down from her face, and she continues speaking, saying, "I worked it out, because it's in a ring. It's all in a ring." And as John helps to sit her up, she leans against John, and John looks really, freaked out, or just, this is hitting him really hard, because he notices that Angie's blood is covering his hands as well. And then we see a very determined look on his face as he looks towards Elster Tower, and we get a good look at Angie now as well. We can see her face has been sliced on the cheek like we saw, but also there's some sort of symbols carved on her forehead, and then some chunk is taken out of her rib cage area, and also it looks like she was stabbed or cut very deep and multiple times on her chest. And over this gruesome panel, the narration says, "A bottle smashed somewhere nearby, and a police siren Dopplered as it wailed past. Saturday night up the valley. Keep a low profile," he thought. "Stay under the radar. Fuck that." And those two very poignant words are the last words of this issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.